Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this American Inspiration event presented in partnership with American Ancestors 10 Million Names Project. I'm Margaret Talcott, Director of Literary Programs, the creator and producer of this book talk series. All of us behind the scenes are delighted you're with us tonight in the land of history during this week of Juneteenth, looking at life on the sea and emancipation, the maritime founding, the roots, systems, and people of the Underground Railroad. On your screen is the schedule for our hour-long event centered on the work of Marcus Rediker, his book, Freedom Ship, The Uncharted History of Escaping Slavery by Sea. Professor Rediker will soon take the screen to discuss his research and share some historical images for approximately 25 minutes. Then our guest moderator, historian Lee Blake, will join him in conversation. Dr. Blake has a rich knowledge of this topic and has many great questions of her own. But we welcome questions from you as well, the audience. So please feel free to enter your queries at any time into the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Tonight's event is being recorded by my colleagues in our Brew Family Learning Center. The video will be sent to all registered attendees in the next 24 hours. It's made especially for participants who could not attend at this very moment or had difficulties technically. As good as tonight might be, of course, the real education comes from reading tonight's featured work, Freedom Ship. Copies of the hardcover can be purchased from our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Massachusetts. As you order from them, do input the code AMINS25 and your book will come signed by the author on a bookplate. This link and information is being shared in the chat. Now for some background on our guests this evening. Marcus Rediker is the Distinguished Professor of Atlantic History at the University of Pittsburgh and the author of The Slave Ship, A Human History, and The Amistad Rebellion, An Atlantic Odyssey of Slavery and Freedom, among many other works. His books have won numerous awards and have been translated into 19 languages. Our moderator, Dr. Lee Blake, is a public historian and president of the New Bedford Historical Society. Dr. Blake has received several national, state, and local awards in historic preservation for her work preserving the history and legacy of the Underground Railroad and the abolition movement. Most importantly, for my organization, Dr. Blake is a vital partner in the 10 Million Names Project, offering invaluable guidance and expertise concerning particularly New Bedford history. She played a leading role in establishing our collaboration with the New Bedford Public Library, which includes the digitization of many key materials. We're deeply grateful for Dr. Blake's contribution and the dedication of her team, and by extension, everyone at work on this project down in New Bedford. You'll hear more from her in the second half of our program this evening. But first, welcome to you, Professor Rediker. I am just delighted that you're joining me in discussion this evening. I have learned so much from your book, which provides really brilliant portraits of life on the sea and in many ports. I mean, we traveled in reading this all over Baltimore, New Orleans, New York, New Bedford, Boston, and all the way across the sea to Liverpool. And I really enjoyed it. I'm a true believer now of in the centrality of maritime history, particularly as it relates to the Underground Railroad, a system of emancipation, which, as you say, it grew over 30 years, which I don't think many of us can comprehend 30 years. And it grew into really, as you say, an irrepressible history-changing force. Again, I learned so much, and tonight's audience is going to be really eager to hear more. So welcome to you, Professor Rediker. And shall we start right in? Over to you.
Let's go.
Let's go.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Margaret. It is a real pleasure for me to be here. To be with all of you who have assembled. I am happy to talk with you about this new book, Freedom Ship. And I'll just begin by saying a little bit about the long and crooked path I took in writing it. I actually began to work on this subject in the late 1980s as I was writing a book with Peter Linebaugh called The Many-Headed Hydra. And I was reading advertisements for people who had emancipated themselves and escaped slavery. And I kept finding a recurrent theme in these ads. Uh, they might say, last seen in the company of sailors, or they might say, knows the work of the sea. And a very common one was the ad saying, captains of vessels are warned not to take this person on board. So I worked on this many years ago. I gave a lecture on the subject in 1990 called The Maritime Frontier of Freedom. That work did not go into the book that I was writing at that time. And so these many years later, I've circled back to the topic. Now, since then, some very important work has been done on the subject. And I would like to mention three people in particular, David Siselsky, Cassandra Newby Alexander, and Timothy Walker, a very close colleague of Lee Blake in New Bedford. They have done foundational work on this topic, and I'm very grateful to them. I'd also like to say that this book is in many ways a sequel to a book that Margaret mentioned at the outset, and that is a book I wrote called The Slave Ship, A Human History. In that awful history of the Middle Passage, the West African people who were forced aboard those vessels underwent an experience of torture, terror, mass death. But what strikes me in this project as a sequel is that the descendants of those people turned the ships and the sea into the opposite, into a place of liberation and freedom. And that is the story that I seek to tell. So I'm going to suggest to you that thousands of people, actually tens of thousands of people, escaped bondage by working with sailors and dock workers and market women, other waterfront workers. And they together turned this ship into an instrument of liberation. If we could have the first slide, please. Okay. Yes. So I want to end this lecture in about 20 minutes or so by posing two questions. First of all, if these maritime escapes are so common and significant, why have they been invisible to us? Okay, that's one question I want to address. And the second question is, in the ultimate scheme of things, in interpreting American history, why do they matter? So I'm going to speak less about the Underground Railroad, rather more about what we might call the overseas freeway. Not going to talk about runaways. I'm going to talk about sailaways, because these fugitives who got on board these vessels helped to create the world's first migrant solidarity movement. Okay, next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry. Could we go back to the ship before, Kathleen? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about context. And I want to also show you this image of the tall ship, which is one of the most important machines in global history. It is actually a machine. And what I want you to understand is that in the 19th century, this kind of vessel and many other kinds of vessels were extraordinarily important to not only the American economy, but the Atlantic and the global economy. To give you an example of magnitude, if you look at the totality of trade goods carried by ships, it's probably 8 or 9 times as great as what was carried by railroads in this period. So this is an age of a golden age, you might say, of maritime transport. Okay, so American slavery is part of an Atlantic slave system. It is part of a crucial part of a system of global capitalism. The years of this book are roughly 1830 to 1860, 61. At the beginning of that period, roughly 2 million people are enslaved in the United States. By the end of that period, the number has grown to 4 million. These people produce the commodities for the world economy. They produce these hogsheads of tobacco, barrels of rice, bales of cotton. And cotton, of course, is a key to the Industrial Revolution, which is raging around, all around the Atlantic at this time. That's because the cutting edge of that Industrial Revolution is textiles, usually made of cotton. Okay, next slide, please. One of the things I was very keen to reveal in this book is the deep structure of escape by sea. And here I have an image created by someone named Ben Schmidt, who was working with a series of ship logs, captains' records about their voyages in the early 19th century. And what he was finding is that American vessels went everywhere, but most importantly, Northern vessels went from the northern ports, Philadelphia, New York, New Bedford, Boston, to southern ports and back again. Okay, every one of these black lines that you see on this image represents a voyage. And if you look on the east coast of what is North America, you see this very dark collection of lines. That, folks, is the coastal trade, which is crucial to the story that I'm telling. So what I want to say is that the structure of trade is also the structure of escape. Next slide, please. I began the story in 1829, 1830. A man named David Walker, an African-American abolitionist, a man of the waterfront. He sells clothing to sailors in Boston. He publishes David Walker's Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, in which he asks everyone to follow the revolutionary example of Haiti and to rise up and destroy this system of bondage. It's an unusually revolutionary tract. What's most interesting for our purposes is that Walker used sailors, black sailors and white sailors, to smuggle the pamphlet to southern ports. And sometimes he would actually sew the pamphlets into the clothing so that they could go ashore without anyone seeing them. Now, what's important about this is that in the 1830s, this presages, and actually you might say triggers, a very rebellious decade. The resistance to slavery in the 1830s is fierce. And in this context, running away by sea or by any means acquires a new and very threatening political valence. Okay, so I have studied in this book, in Freedom Ship, I've studied 9 ports. 5 ports in the South. These are the places of exit: Savannah, Georgia, Charleston, South Carolina, Wilmington, North Carolina, Norfolk, Virginia, and Baltimore, Maryland. And then I've also studied 4 receiving ports: Philadelphia, New York City, New Bedford, and Boston. And what I found is that in these 4 receiving ports, the majority of people are arriving by sea. And when they arrive, they have a really important effect. They basically push abolitionists to form new kinds of organizations that will give assistance to these people who have sailed away from bondage. So here we see a major theme of the book. Action taken from below by fugitives with the help of their fellow workers triggers innovation in the abolitionist movement. I'll say more about that in just a minute. Next slide, please. This is an image of the Hudson River docks in New York. I think it's probably the best image I have ever seen because it shows you just how vast and chaotic these waterfronts actually were. This is an image in which people are moving cargo. You see lots of different groups of people. The docks, such as this, are a strategic location in the rise of global capitalism. They're sort of a rough place, a violent place, a dangerous place. Desperate people come and go with the tides. But these are the places where the commodities that are produced in the hinterlands around the port city flow into this area, and from there they go on into the world market. So my book is very much a dockside labor history. The people who do the work on the waterfront, they're known as a motley crew. That means they are multi-ethnic, they are multiracial, they are international, and they are cosmopolitan, and they are the linchpins, you might say, in this kind of global chain of commodities that is the essence of capitalism at this moment. Okay, now if we look at this same image from above, from the point of view of merchants who own these ships or ship captains who sail them, what we see basically is a very serious problem of policing. How are you going to keep people from getting on board these ships, or in the case of New York, from exiting these ships to freedom? So policing, guards, constables, customs officers, the watch, as it's frequently called, and slave catchers. New York was known because it swarmed with slave catchers designed to take people off the ships and carry them back into bondage. This is actually very important. Now, in the South, one of the things that happens is that all of these southern ports and more that I've not mentioned began to pass in 1822 what are called Negro Seaman Acts. This basically was something that recognized the revolutionary actions of Black sailors and tried to remove them and quarantine them when a ship sailed into the southern port so as to minimize their contact with the enslaved population, which did work, as we'll see, as dock workers and people along the waterfront. So Black sailors were quarantined because resistance is contagious. Everybody knew this. So I want you to see the port city, especially these docks, as places where the forces of slavery and anti-slavery collided. We don't usually see them this way, but this was a real zone of struggle. Okay, I want to talk now about who are the players in this drama of escaping slavery by sea. And of course, it begins with the fugitives themselves. Very important to know that the people who took those decisions to try to get aboard a ship, they are risking everything. They might actually lose their lives, and some did. A failed escape attempt would result in the loss of flesh on your back. So they take all the risks. You'll notice in my telling of the story, the abolitionists are important, but they don't really come into it until the very end. There are all these things happening before people ever actually see Northern abolitionists. I think that's really important. Okay, the fugitives. A second player, collective player, you might say, are the free Black communities in both the southern and the northern ports. These are people who are going to play an absolutely critical role in helping fugitives to find a ship and in sheltering fugitives when they arrive in the northern port cities. This is critical. And frequently the people who worked in those free Black communities were themselves waterfront workers. So they were in a position to know. They had these strategic locations along the waterfront, like the one you see right here. The next most important group are sailors. If we could have the next slide, please. The motley crew, sailors, these mixed race sailors who make the ships of the Atlantic go. Their labor is crucial to everything. Black sailors are especially important. They play a leading role in all this. And here we have an image of none other than Frederick Douglass, one of probably the global 19th century's greatest abolitionists, who escaped slavery in Maryland in 1838. What's really critical here is that Douglass lived on Fells Point in Baltimore. He was a man of the waterfront. He was trained as a maritime artisan. And as he says in his autobiography, when it was time for me to escape, I dressed like a sailor. I talked like a sailor. I walked like a sailor. I escaped with a protection certificate of a Black sailor named Stanley. So Douglas is a very good example of how the knowledge of the waterfront makes it possible to escape. Next image, please. Here's a really unusual illustration drawn by a British artist in 1853 when he visited Charleston, South Carolina. You'll see at the lower right of the image, he calls these men wharf hands. These are the probably enslaved Black dock workers who also occupied this very strategic position. And I don't know if you can see it on the projection, but the man at the lower right wearing the hat basically says, I didn't hear nothing. It's almost as if somebody was asking him about a maritime escapee. This is the way solidarity would be expressed. He knows somebody is hiding out among the bales of cotton, but I didn't see nothing. The next image, please. You may be a little surprised to know that this is another revolutionary worker, a market woman. This one in Baltimore, which we see at the left. This is a portrait painted by the artist Thomas Waterman Wood in 1858. The woman is carrying, as you can see, vegetables. It might have been fruits, it might have been cakes or pies, but she and others like her worked on the waterfront, and very often they went on board the ships when they pulled into harbor to sell food to hungry sailors. And these women would ask those sailors, out of the hearing of the captain or mate, do you have any fugitives on board? And if there were, and frequently there were, they would go back and convey this information to the abolitionist group, the vigilance committee, and they would then come and organize a midnight rescue of the fugitive aboard that ship. Okay, and that then brings us to the last group, the Northern abolitionists, which are very important. But I want to emphasize in particular one kind of abolitionist group, the Vigilance Committee. Vigilance Committee, the first one was formed in New York in 1835, the second in 1837 in Philadelphia, the third 1841 in Boston. And these are the people who made it their purpose to assist sailaways, to help people who had made it to their port find their way to freedom. So here's the point about the port city. The cooperation created by merchants, by capitalists, cooperation among many different kinds of workers is all to serve the system of profit. But notice, once these workers know and learn and cooperate from each other, they develop their own subversive projects. And one of these is escaping bondage by sea. Okay, so let's talk for a moment about how this all worked. Excuse me. And let's use the example of Boston. Boston in the 1830s was the most advanced center of abolitionism in the US. The number of abolitionists were small. A foundation of the group was the Free Black community of about 2,300 people. In 1850, very militant and well organized. Of course, this is where the American Anti-Slavery Society was formed. William Lloyd Garrison published The Liberator, but there's this steady arrival of escapees by sea that mobilizes the abolitionists to pay attention, to see the necessity of this work. I've argued in the book that there are 7 cases of maritime escape in Boston between 1836 and 1854, which are crucial to understanding how the abolitionist movement developed, how it innovated, how it became popular, how it gained new kinds of power. The first of these in 1836 was a decidedly female affair from beginning to end, because 2 African-American women escaped to Boston, Eliza Small and Polly Ann Bates, who were captured, taken into court, where an uprising in the courtroom literally saved her, rescued her, carried her out into the streets. All this was done by women, mostly Black working women. carried her out into the streets and into the carriage by which they got away. So this was a really important precedent of direct action taken against the institution of slavery. Originally, the abolitionists were opposed to this. They thought this was too rough, too illegal, but slowly they'll catch up and see the necessity of this kind of direct action. I also want to mention briefly a married couple of sailaways, George and Rebecca Latimer, who in 1842 arrived in Boston from Norfolk. What happened in the aftermath of their high-profile case was truly extraordinary, because abolitionists organized a drive to gather signatures. 205 towns in Massachusetts, involving 65,000 people, signed petitions to the state legislature to protect these people who had arrived after emancipating themselves from slavery. This resulted in the Personal Liberty Act of 1843, which made it much harder for Southern enslavers to recover their human property. I want to talk now a little bit about Thomas Sims. If we could have the next image, please. Thomas Sims was a mason in Savannah, Georgia, got aboard a ship, made it all the way to Boston. It looked like he was going to gain his freedom until a slave catcher showed up. There ended up being a fierce struggle, a fight. He fought hard to maintain his freedom. He stabbed one of the slave catchers in the knee. He was finally returned to slavery in Savannah, then sold to someone in New Orleans, but then he escaped by water yet again, came back to Boston, spoke to 1,000 people who cheered wildly at his triumph. Okay, so what we see in all this is abolitionists are learning from the escapees. They're devising new tactics, new strategies, new organizations, new communications, new legislation, and they're also increasing popular involvement. And just to illustrate that point, it was only several dozen people, mostly African American, who liberated Eliza Small and Polly Ann Bates. But when Anthony Burns was taken back to slavery in 1854, very nearly 50,000 people showed up to protest that action of the Fugitive Slave Act. So you can see how the movement has grown. Okay, next and final slide, please. Let me circle back to our questions that I posed at the outset. Oh yeah, this is the brig Acorn taking Thomas Sims out to sea. And then the next slide, please. Okay, why are people like Thomas Sims and Polly Ann Bates and the like so largely unknown to us? Now, there are many reasons, but I want to concentrate on two. First of all, this notion Underground Railroad is a metaphor. It's a metaphor. It organizes our understanding and it points us in the wrong direction, making us think that only the landed sites of escape need to be studied. This in turn is linked to another issue. I've always wondered why it is that people think that history happens only on land, when of course it also happens at sea. And I invented a word to try to describe this bias in our thinking. I called it terracentrism, or land-centered history. It's almost as if the seas are seen as ahistorical voids. But of course, history happens at sea, including the freedom struggle I'm talking about right now. And then finally, why does this matter? I think there are two important reasons. One, we need to rethink running away or sailing away, not as an individualistic act, but something that was social and collective and depended on connections among working people. It's not vertical like manumission, it's horizontal. It depends on your fellow workers. It depends on solidarity. And then the last point, this also helps us to rethink abolitionism from below. We were compelled to think for a long time that abolition was simply a gift from middle and upper class enlightened men. But now we see it's really an important issue of resistance and action from below. So these people who escaped by sea and by land uh, helped to cause the Civil War in 1861. I think more and more historians now accept this, a major cause, one among many, but with the help of other workers, these fugitives transgressed and defied borders. And I want to talk to Lee about this in just a moment. So it was fugitives, dock workers, market women, sailors, free black workers, the motley crew. They're not usually considered to be abolitionists, but they were. And folks, they made history, very important history. Thank you.
Marcus, while Lee is working on that, let me do an audience question or so. Why not? Because we've got some good ones in here. And Lee, just speak right up the moment that you can, and we'll come back to you because your questions are going to be fascinating. One question we had was, is there a modern equivalent to the 19th century port in terms of culture and activity? There's been a fascination in these ports being so international, and what would you say, the airport in Dubai? I mean, what is the modern equivalent?
The modern equivalent is the seaports of the world by which 80% of world commerce still takes place. I went years ago on something called Semester at Sea, where you go around the world on a ship. And in every seaport where the ship docked, we saw the same scenes. We saw the motley crew. We saw people doing the work. So this is by no means simply a matter of the past. Most of our waterfronts now are not as public as they were in the 19th century, but they're every bit as important.
That I believe that, and think of those container ships, and think of the Somalian pirates, and think
Yeah.
of what's going over our seas. Okay, another question here. Fascinating history. Is there any evidence that sailaways hid on coastal islands in the north rather than in major ports? Are there any so-called Negro islands in Maine, for example, linked to runaways? Negro islands with quotation marks.
I'm not a specialist on the history of Maine, but I can tell you this. People seeking freedom would go wherever their chances were best to maintain and preserve it. And sometimes that meant if you came to New York, you had to find somewhere else because there were just so many slave catchers. But a key issue, and this is actually true for New Bedford, Lee may want to talk about this, the combination of a maritime economy and a Quaker elite that was opposed to slavery made New Bedford a particularly attractive place, because you would have not only the opportunity to get a job, you would have people who would have some sympathy for your plight as you're trying to gain your own freedom.
And this also was an opportunity to talk a little bit about Native Americans and how Native people worked. For instance, off the coast of New Bedford, you have Martha's Vineyard. So sometimes people who are sailaways would go to Martha's Vineyard, and the Native people would take them into their reservation. And at another point in time, they would transport the sailaways to New Bedford. So that's kind of a trade also. I can't speak to some other islands, but the Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, the islands around Massachusetts had that kind of carry on.
And of course, Lee, as you know very well, one of the tactics that escapees would use would be to come to New Bedford and then get on board a whaling vessel, which would allow you to disappear from the slave catchers for 3 years at a time.
And you were out to sea, no one would come and look for you.
Exactly. They're not going to come all the way to the Pacific to try to find you.
That's right. And it's also interesting when we talk about William Still. William Still in Pennsylvania was working with the Underground Railroad, the Overland Underground Railroad, but he would sit with a sailaway or a fugitive and go over what their employment history was, and then say, which he did with Frederick Douglass, well, you're a caulker, you should go to New Bedford. you will find work there, your family will be free there. So it really was like employment training in some ways.
Was.
And that's also one of the things that you talk about is this whole network of people who were free African Americans, who also were individuals who, like in Maryland, some of those people were free. Some of the individuals who were Africans were not free, but they were working on the waterfront. And they create a whole network and a community, not just workers. They developed churches, they developed schools. And they made sure that if a sail away or a runaway came in, he would have a pathway somewhere to freedom.
Absolutely true. This is the crucial nature of that, especially the free Black communities. Because, for example, in Boston, you had the Fugitive Slave Church,
Right.
presided over by Reverend Leonard Grimes. So there were these systems of solidarity that would work for the people who had escaped once they arrive in the North. Food, shelter, clothing, employment. These were the kind of things that William Still and many others wanted to provide.
And you talked about the vigilant committees. So there were Black and white benevolent societies that supported people who ran away. There were the vigilant committees, which, in a city like New Bedford, there might have been 1,000 free Blacks living in New Bedford with small population, 14,000. But those free Blacks would be vigilant. And that meant that they would look around and they would see people who they didn't know and find out what business they had in the city. Were they there for jobs? Were they there as slave catchers? And if they were there as slave catchers, then the vigilant committees would take care of them, meaning they would let them know that their lives were in danger if they were going to stay in New Bedford and harass people.
The militant free Black community of New Bedford is a very important part of this story, as you know. And of course, Frederick Douglass, when he arrived there, was hugely impressed by it, saying, there are people here who will fight for my life. They'll fight for your life if you make it to New Bedford. So this is a very big part of the freedom story, even though they may not be a huge part of the population. Although I think in New Bedford, they were a larger percentage than in any other city. It's that critical mass of people that you can turn to for support, who are politically committed to freedom for everyone.
And they formed churches. We have churches in New Bedford. The Bethel AME Church is getting ready to celebrate its 200th anniversary. These churches were formed, their founders were all fugitives and sailaways. And that's part of the work that we've been doing in terms of genealogy, is to be able to trace how those people came to New Bedford and really embroider their relatives, their cousins, how they worked, and how they left New Bedford if they went on a whaling ship and did they come back. Because whaling was such an economic powerhouse, we've been able to chart and really look at a lot of the whale logs and see where people went. But did they come back? Did they come back to New Bedford? Were there family members in New Bedford? But New Bedford becomes a way of looking at, in some ways, chain migration. Because once people hear about the positive environment and the possibilities of jobs, and it was no wonderful place, but people could get jobs, people could bring their families, people could send for their nieces and nephews and bring them to New Bedford and stay and live here.
Speaking of genealogy, Lee, could you talk a little bit about your own genealogy as a descendant of sailaways?
Well, one of the fascinating things is that I work with a lot of the African American historical organizations, and we all share information. And I have been lucky to find out about my own family members. I have, in 1826, my family came from Alexandria, Virginia. My fifth great grandparents and their children. They came with 5 children on a boat, and the individual was a Quaker captain who did not believe in slavery, of course, and the Quakers believed that everybody had a soul and had the ability to worship. So my family comes to New Bedford in 1826, and immediately, people would come, they would start schools, they would train people, they became gatekeepers to help people move forward. And my family did that, and my 14 and 12-year-old relatives who worked on the boats, they would go down and they would say to the captains, "Is there a good place to bring my family?" And people would say, "Go to New Bedford."
True, absolutely true. You are the embodiment of this history, Lee.
That's right. And I enjoy meeting a number of the descendants who are either fugitives or sailaways. I love that word, sailaways. Um, Really, we meet and we talk, and all of us share information, are writing in journals, and telling that whole narrative story that has really been uncovered by you, myself, Tim Walker, and Catherine Grover is another person to
Yeah,
mention. And
absolutely.
Catherine Grover's book, The Fugitives, Gibraltar, is an amazing history of New Bedford, that whole period of 1810, just before the Civil War. But we've been doing genealogy work and workshops all the time.
Very important work. New Bedford has led the way here, I'd say.
Now, one thing I wanted to ask you, there are so many daring escapes and, the stuffs of legend. Are there any particular ones that stick out to you that you haven't mentioned today?
Well, as you know, Lee, I began the book with the story of Thomas Jones,
Mm-hmm.
a dock worker in Wilmington, North Carolina, who managed to free his family, his wife and children, to get them to New York, and then made a deal with a sailor to ship himself out. It proved to be a harrowing voyage, and he made this escape. He had been discovered, and the captain who discovered him was going to send him back to Wilmington. But he did this very clever thing. He managed to bind together a bunch of boards, staves in the ship, and to create a little raft. And he sort of launched himself out into the waters not far from Staten Island. And then here comes the ship's mate after him, but he waves his hat to a couple of sailors and said, "Help me, help me." They took him on board their boat and they said, "Are you a runaway?" And then he said, "Yes." He said, "You're with friends." So
Yeah,
these
right.
sailors provided that solidarity. They protected him. They then took him and helped him find a place. And of course, this becomes an extraordinary story of freedom. This man, Thomas Jones.
And while we talk about the sailways and the dangers that they were in, the dock workers and the captains also faced fines and jail time for any assistance that they gave. And when I read your book and you go, city by city, and you talk about the way policing is done on almost every single port, I mean, it's just fascinating, all the rules and regulations, the different Negro Seaman Acts that had to be passed.
Well, Lee, look, it's to me, it's kind of ironic. Most professional historians don't know much about this system of maritime escapes, but I
Hmm.
guarantee you, Southern enslavers knew a lot about it. Uh,
Hmm.
they had to know a lot about it. They're constantly devising new ways to try to combat it, some of which are actually kind of creative in bizarre ways. In North Carolina, they started setting these sort of sulfur bombs off in the hold of the ship to fumigate, create this
Hmm.
gaseous feeling that would force someone who was hiding on the ship to come out, choking and coughing. So the people in the South who were dealing with the massive, quite massive loss of quote human property, they were very well aware of all this, and they did everything they could to prevent it. But their actions were not equal to the will to be free.
Right.
And no matter how much money they spent, no matter what kinds of things they came up with, this force was irrepressible. These people kept going and kept going.
So fumigating the sheep was one way, and there are stories of actually some women who were in the holds of ship who were fumigated, and they talk about how holding their breath the whole time and waiting until that whole kind of torturous behavior is over, and then the ship can go.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
they
no,
are worried.
these are amazing stories. There's another instance of two men who developed this certain kind of cloth that they would pull over their heads and breathe through water filtered rags. So this was a struggle. The authorities came up with a way to try to choke people out, and then people came up with ways to defeat them.
Mhm,
And I
mhm.
think this is just part of the battle. It's a battle of wits. See, this is another thing I emphasize in the book, that successfully escaping bondage is every bit as much an intellectual challenge as it is a physical challenge. There are all kinds of knowledge you need to have to be able to do this. And so to see how ingenious these many escapes were, to me, this is one of the most inspiring things about doing this kind of research.
Well, I'd like to go back to women for a minute. And of course, we have the example of Harriet Jacobs. And Harriet and her brother John both visited New Bedford on several occasions. But the other thing is that the women recognized that if they had children, those children were going to be slaves. If they had children, their children were going to be enslaved. So women began to think of different ways to escape. And there is a story of a woman who, like Henry Box Brown, gets into a box and is shipped off. But her whole idea was that she was going to get married in Canada to a free Black man, and they wanted to have free children. They did not want their children sold. And it's another component of how people thought about ways that women had to deal with the threats, sexual harassment, border fence, making sure that they didn't have children. And of course, they would get beaten if they were trying to have an abortion. That's a whole other story. But you had these stories about women who recognized that unless they escaped, their children would be slaves.
This is a very important part of their conception of freedom,
Mm-hmm.
that they wanted to raise their children in a free situation.
Right.
So this is a hugely important motivation. It was of interest to me, Lee, that I was curious to see whether the people who escaped by sea were more or less than the percentage of women who escaped by land. It turns out it's a little bit higher. And many of those women got away with children because they were able to make a deal with the ship captain.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's really crucial. And if you've got protection, whether it's a sailor or a captain, once you get on board their ship, you're going to be pretty safe until you're very far away from those enslavers. And this makes a whole new life, including family life, possible.
Mm-hmm. So it is bringing forward and highlighting these stories are just phenomenal for, I do a lot of work with young people. And, the first thing they say is, well, why did the slaves run away? Well, they did. And it's just that is not reported to you. That's not anything you're going to read about, but I'm going to tell you about that. I'm going to tell you how they ran away and what they did and under what circumstances. So we've been able to do that in New Bedford and also create new historic districts that focus on the abolition movement, where people never thought that was very important.
And also to say how much courage it took.
Mm-hmm.
And also to say how much intelligence it took. The wit, there was a man named Thomas Chambers who pulled off the most extraordinary ruse by pretending to be a free person of color and getting on board a steamship and acting this part so convincingly that nobody had any idea that he was escaping slavery. So you just see these these endlessly repeated, very clever ways of escaping. And this is one of the things I loved about doing the work on this book, to be able to spend time with so many courageous people.
Well, you mentioned Frederick Douglass, who spends a good 5 years in New Bedford, starts his family in New Bedford, but New Bedford is the first place that he comes where he's treated as a free man.
Right.
So in 1838, when he escapes, he comes to New Bedford, and he's just amazed at what Black people in New Bedford are able to do with their communities, the support that they give people, and what's happening now, we're able to do, we as in you and I and others, we're able to do a lot of the research on individuals. And right now, Frederick Douglass's Bailey family is being researched. So he's going to be able, we are going to be able to talk about his brothers and sisters, his aunts and uncles. The stories are being written now by the Bailey side of the family. And they kind of just like dropped off the map because we were always focusing on Frederick. But part of the telling the story is to tell the whole story and to tell the story of people who had to leave their family members for freedom too.
This, Lee, is, as you know, is what I call history from below.
Right,
This is not the history of the highborn or the
right,
presidents or the philosophers or the statesmen. This is the history of ordinary people who fought hard for freedom, who literally built the country that we live in. And to understand their families, their histories, their goals, their hopes, their fears, to me, this is the real stuff of history. This is what we need to know most of all.
So one of the projects I'm working on now is I'm working with our band of genealogists and historians in New Bedford. But New Bedford sends, at the end of the Civil War, New Bedford sends 40 women south to teach. They're trained and they go down south. They're sent by the churches, they're sent by benevolent societies, but everyone understands that now that the Civil War is over and African Americans are going to have freedom, they need to have the skills, math, science, reading. So these women, most of whom have never been out of New Bedford
Right.
before, never been, are going south to teach. And we are telling those stories now too.
Very important to do that. Very important to show what people did for themselves in their own freedom struggles, because part of the rationale for leaving them out of those top-down histories is that what they did was unimportant. But we know
Right.
that quite the opposite is true, that they were living, breathing, acting people who, in this case, actually changed the course of history.
Right.
Right? Helped to bring on civil war, helped to create emancipation. Very important to have this history from below to understand the real causes of historical change.
And we have public schools because of people like this who went south and demanded that education should be for everybody, no matter what color they were. So it's an exciting time to be able to, mine the internet and find these stories and talk with descendants whose family members 3 or 4 generations, 5 generations ago did this work.
That's right. That's right. We have to honor that.
That's right. And especially on Juneteenth. That's what we do. Do we have any questions?
We definitely do. We have quite an active dialogue going here.
Oh, good.
There are a lot of folks weighing in about Maine. And as somebody who is a lover of books, there's a lot of books being referred to in our Q&A, which I don't think anybody else can see but me. But there's a lot of reading about Maine. That people are talking about Paul Harding's book called The Other Side of Eden, which had an island of escapees, Malaga Island, and the port of Portland. So there's a lot of dialogue about Maine. There's also a teacher who has a book to recommend for 8 to 12-year-old children about Lee Waite's Seaward Bourne for children 8 to 12. A retired teacher feels that folks ought to be reading that with 8 to 12-year-olds. But there are also a number of questions about river transport. And were rivers, and certainly for Harriet Tubman, the rivers were a way through
Right.
and out. But maybe you could comment a bit about the use of inland waterways,
Sure,
Marcus,
sure.
as an
Yeah.
avenue of escape.
Yeah, it's very easy for us in these modern days to forget how absolutely crucial water transportation was in the 18th and 19th centuries. Everything moved much more quickly by water, by river, for example. And most of the port cities that I've studied are themselves part of these riverine systems, whereby people would bring commodities down the river. For example, to Charleston, the Three Rivers system, the Savannah River. This is just so important to transport, and so this is crucial. Now, let me say one more thing about what I couldn't do in this book. I thought I would deal with all of the escapes by water everywhere in the United States, but it turns out that subject is so vast.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Turns out there's not one maritime system of escape, there are five. There's the one that is up and down the Mississippi River. There's the one in New Orleans and other port cities that empties into the Gulf of Mexico. There's another in the Caribbean. Then there's the Great Lakes maritime system, which becomes really important after 1850 in the Fugitive Slave Act. So this is a big, big subject. And I did notice, Margaret, a couple of people asking how many people escaped this way.
Mm-hmm.
My estimate in this book is between 15 and 20,000. That is based on the current level of research, which will continue. And my guess is that number will be revised upward. And that is a very significant portion of the total who escaped.
Wow. Wow.
I like to tell people also that the part of the way numbers become important, part of the way people find numbers is how Marcus began this talk, was looking at the advertisements in newspapers. People would write, as in white captains would say, "Have you seen my man? Have you seen my woman?" So you'd get a sense, first of all, that somebody was looking for people and how much they would pay if those people were returned to them. But then you also get the advertisements once the Civil War is over of all the people who are African American who are looking for their family members.
Mm-hmm.
My family member was sold away from me. So the slave ads, advertisements in newspapers became very important. And that's another way to start the subject and the counting. And there are actually websites that do that now. So that gives us a workable number.
That's right. Yeah,
Very good.
I would also mention one of those websites organized by my friend Ed Baptist at Cornell University called Freedom on the Move. Has a database, I think, of almost 30,000 advertisements, which is free and available to the public and really an extraordinary research tool.
Well, that is enormously helpful. And Kathleen, you and I should be writing that down, making sure that gets places, that website. And thank you for sharing that. And incredibly, we are almost wrapped up with our time. So I'm going to move on here, and I'm going to say thank you so much to Lee Blake, Dr. Blake. We are so glad for your input on the ground, and all the work that you're doing. And Marcus, you're not off the hook yet, as we do for all our authors in the American Inspiration Author Series. We've asked Marcus to do a final reading from his book. So over to you for that, and then I'll be back.
Okay. Thank you, Margaret. And Lee, thank you.
Thank you, Marcus.
Good to work with you again. So I want to read a couple of paragraphs from the book, which I think summarize some of the themes that I've already talked about here. This book has recounted a literal history of conspiracy. usually beginning with a hushed conversation between two people, a fugitive and a waterfront worker, in the dark hold of a ship, on a bustling wharf, or in a crowded dancing cellar amid music and merriment. We have seen dozens of examples of how this system worked. Talking and breathing together was the very definition of conspiracy. Others might or might not have joined as the plot advanced. The exchange of subversive whispers was the first breath of solidarity, which over 30 years would grow through thousands of actors and actions into an irrepressible, history-changing force. The last words belong to Harriet Tubman, the fearless leader who used the waterways of Maryland in several of her missions to bring runaways to freedom. She revealed what may have been the deepest meaning of escaping slavery by water. She called it a middle passage to freedom. During her escapes, she ran a tight ship. She once explained to a group of discouraged, discontented, northern-bound fugitives that they had to go through or die. Then she added a threat. A live runaway could do great harm by going back, but a dead one could tell no secrets. She had a pistol at the ready, but added that no one had to die as a traitor. In her mind, and likely in the minds of many others, escaping slavery by sea reversed the historic voyage from Africa into the horrors of American bondage. According to her first biographer, Sarah Bradford, Tubman conveyed a coded biblical message to a friend who worked with her on the passage to freedom. Tell my brothers and sisters that when the good old ship of Zion comes along, to be ready to step on board. Thank you.
So powerful. Thank you, Marcus, for your insight and for painting such a poignant portrait, particularly in that last paragraph, of really what was at stake for enslaved peoples who self-emancipated, and how their bravery, how Harriet Tubman's work and all those whispers changed not only their lives, but our country and the course of emancipation and the course of where we are today. Very grateful to hear that story. Thank you. A reminder to our audience, copies of Freedom Ship can be purchased from our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Do input the code AMINTS25 and your book will come signed by the author. In the chat, you'll see the appropriate link and more information. As I've said to others, this is really a fitting tribute in this week of Juneteenth. So now turning to closing, some information about the organizations this evening. First, most important for this week of Juneteenth, tonight's book talk was produced in partnership with 10 Million Names, whose team of genealogists, historians, volunteers, they're all hard at work building the infrastructure and doing the critical research to recover, restore, and remember the names of the 10 million descendants of enslaved people in our country. We thank tonight's moderator, Lee Blake, who is, as I said, among those leading the effort, and the countless teams that we have through American Ancestors. They are at work across the country, tracking families and names and getting to those 10 million names. We invite you in our audience to get involved if your family, your relatives are, or they could be among the 10 million names. Visit 10millionnames.org to learn more. And we at American Ancestors, the Education Department, are delighted you joined us tonight. If you're researching a time in history or a family, our Brew Family Learning Center hosts many educational programs providing skills for historians. As you can see in the programs on screen, we have insights and tips to share across so many categories of research. Free to the public, you can chat with one of our genealogists 5 days a week. Our members can access unique databases any time of day or night, billions of searchable records. They can also visit for free our reopened headquarters and its archives at 97 Newbury Street in Boston, and our public exhibition, The Family History Experience. Our mission and all we do is to educate, inspire, and connect people through scholarship, our collections, and our expertise. And for you literary sorts, history lovers out there, on June 23, we're welcoming an illustrious panel of author academics who will look at the years 1860 to 1920 and the march to freedom for all Americans. Author Bennett Parton will report on Sherman's march to the sea, the perspective of enslaved peoples who marched to freedom with him, behind the soldiers of the Union Army. And author Manisha Sinha will look particularly at the impact and failure of Reconstruction and civil rights for everyone, immigrants, women, and Black Americans. She sees the Reconstruction is going right through and through the Jim Crow era and up to 1920. It's a very interesting premise. Their presentations will be followed by a discussion with the two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, historian Alan Taylor, who is special to our organization as a Lifetime Achievement Award winner. On July 7, just in time for summer travels, American style, we'll hear about Ike's road trip, as in Dwight Eisenhower, and we'll look at the history of our highways in this country. Author Brian Black will be joined by author and presidential speechwriter Ted Widmer. Together, they will share keen insight on America's car culture and progress since Eisenhower's 1919 convoy across our country. And on July 22, we're presenting the book Fatherhood, A History of Love and Power, the work of Augustine Sedgwick. This book is a perfect thing, entertainment on a family vacation. So we hope you'll come back. But for now, back to tonight. Many thanks to our guests this evening, Marcus Rediker and Lee Blake, for this history lesson during the week of Juneteenth. Behind the scenes, thank you to my colleague Kathleen McKenzie of our Brew Family Learning Center, and to our audience out there in Zoom land, all of you with the technical ons and offs here. We thank you for joining us and for sticking with us. We appreciate your interest in America's history and in family history in all its diversity. We'll hope to see you soon again, but for now, Marcus, Lee, thank you again, and a good night to all.
Good night.
Good night.